Our next topic is on anti-bullying, and we are here with someone very familiar to our show. Dr. Susan Strauss is here with us, and she, of course, is our bullying harassment consultant and an author.
Hi, Ali.
Hello. So glad you're with us to give us some
thank you.
more discussion and updates and tell us what's going on with the anti-bullying legislation. But before we get there, I think,
Yes.
Uma, we should start with the...
Definitely. Would you explain to us a little bit about what bullying really means?
Yeah.
You know, we'd like to know more about what it is and
Yes.
Well, that is part of the problem, is that we don't have a consistent definition of bullying. Researchers don't define it the same way, schools don't define it the same way, states don't define it the same way. So we've got this ethereal type of definition. But in essence, bullying is an intentional and it's a persistent, demeaning and intimidating behavior directed towards one or more people. And the intent is to make the target feel demeaned, intimidated, less than.
Okay.
And targets are selected for who knows what reason, because somebody might not like their hair or the clothes they wear or the shoes they wear, or maybe they're targeted because they're smarter than others in the classroom or not as smart, or maybe because they're attractive or not attractive. It could be any number of reasons, but the distinction often comes is that the term bullying gets used when we're referring really to illegal harassment.
Okay.
For example, the U.S. Department of Education states that only, and I don't mean only to minimize the number, but only 30% of kids in the United States are bullied, whereas research shows that up to 50% of kids are sexually harassed. And out of the kids that are disabled, 60% of disabled children are harassed because of their disability. That said, we end up using the word bullying to define what sexual harassment, and disability harassment, or religious harassment, or racial harassment is, and it's a misnomer, and it conflates the two terms and what they mean. And we also know, for example, that while bullying can be very negative in terms of a child's mental health, their physical health, and their ideas about coming to school, if you are sexually harassed, you are impacted more severely than if you are bullied. So there are distinctions, even though what we're finding is that the term is getting used in, to replace the words harassment. And now that's dangerous to do because it interferes with the ability to get to the root cause. If you're always labeling everything bullying, and yet you've got a disabled student who's being illegally harassed because that's illegal, then you're never dealing with, well, why is a student picking on a student who's disabled? Instead, we call it bullying, and then you don't have to get to the root causes of what is a disability and what's it like to be disabled and how do you suppose your tracking of this person is impacting them.
Well, Uma and I both have children, and
Yes.
in middle school particularly, and so I think when some people hear this topic of bullying, particularly in the schools, they might think, well, you know, it's just the parents just being overprotective and that helicoptering. And
yes.
But Susan, just speak to us to tell us what are the impacts for those kids, for example? Why does this matter so much?
Well, for both bullying and harassment, the impact can be terrible. It can include, you know, we knew with Anoka Hennepin students, and that wasn't bullying actually, that wasn't based on the students' protected class, they were GLBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, but we had kids that were committing suicide. So what we see is that children that are being bullied or harassed, there can be a drop in their grades, they don't want to go to school, they get physical symptoms. So one child, for example, had diarrhea. Another one would get to school and he would throw up. Another child, an elementary school child, developed a tic. So you've got psychological ramifications, you've got the school-related ramifications, and then you've also got a physical response as well. Those are the three categories that kids generally drop down in. So it has severe ramifications.
Yeah, you must have read in the recent newspaper too, I don't know whether you read that one boy, he wanted to be in the cheerleading clinic. But typically it's for girls, right? So he was like so embarrassed, but he liked it so much he wanted to be there. But kids kept on like, you know, teasing him like, you know, you're not a girl to be in the cheerleading clinic. And then he just committed suicide.
And
my
that
God,
would not be bullying. It
I know,
would be
that's why I wanted to
sexual
know.
harassment.
I wanted to know them, just what
Well,
does that mean?
So sexual harassment is illegal and bullying is not.
Okay.
So even though Minnesota has got an anti-bullying law, it is not actionable, which means if the school district does not in fact engage what the act encourages, there's no action that any parent or student can take. So would you like to hear about the Minnesota
Yes,
Safe Schools
please.
Act?
Yeah.
One of the problems with the act, and I think it's great that we've got one, is it conflates bullying and harassment. I work as an expert witness in lawsuits, and one of the things that I see repeatedly is that schools continuously misrepresent harassment as bullying. The problem with that is it makes a difference as to which policy they use to deal with it.
Okay.
It makes a difference as to what training materials they use for teachers and staff, and it also influences any educational materials that they use for students. So school districts rarely are teaching faculty, staff, and students about harassment of any protected class. And by a protected class, I'm talking about those factions of society where we are protected by civil rights law. So being gay, being black, being a Jew, being a Christian, being darker in color, what is your creed? So there, we have in Minnesota, between federal and state laws, we have 15 protected classes. And the schools fail to differentiate between those. So when a student comes forward to complain, they may say, well, I'm being bullied. And they don't, schools generally don't have somebody who's been really trained in how to investigate. Well, is it bullying or is it illegal harassment? If it is harassment, they are required by law to take all reasonable steps to make it stop. There is no such requirement for bullying. They, if they don't make it stop, by law, parents can sue the district to make them make it stop. There is no such ability to do so with the Minnesota law. And it conflates it. So let me just tell you what it says here. This is all one sentence, by the way. Intimidating, threatening, abusive, or harming conduct may involve, but is not limited to, conduct that causes physical harm to a student or a student's property, or causes a student to be in reasonable fear of harm to person or property, under Minnesota common law, violates a student's reasonable expectation of privacy, defames a student, or constitutes intentional infliction of emotional distress against a student, is directed at any student or students, including those based on a person's actual or perceived race, ethnicity, color, creed, religion, national origin, immigration status, sex, marital status, familial status, socioeconomic status, physical appearance, sexual orientation, including gender identity and expression, academic status related to student performance disability, or status with regard to public assistance, age, or any additional characteristic defined in 363A. That's one sentence of a two-sentence paragraph. Then it says, however, prohibited conduct need not be based on any particular characteristic defined in this paragraph.
So that
So
doesn't,
it's very confusing, and
I
it
know.
confuses
Yeah.
all these protected classes, although the Minnesota Safe Schools Act includes those that are not included in a protected class based on civil rights law.
okay.
Then it talks about cyberbullying briefly, and then it says the act requires that there be a policy that is provided, posted, reviewed, and revised. How often it needs to be reviewed and revised, we don't know, and that it must be discussed with students. The school district is required, based on this act, to use research-based, developmentally appropriate best practices. There are not very many of those out there. The one that they almost always use is by an author by the name of Oveus. Now, there's been research that supports that anti-bullying curriculum in other countries, particularly Scandinavian. It has not received wide research support here in the U.S. because we're not Scandinavia. And yet, consistently, that's what the schools are using. When I work as an expert witness, I'll say, I'd like to see all of your sexual harassment materials that you're using for the school. What do they bring out? They're anti-bullying. They don't get it, and this won't help.
So what do we, but when you hear that,
Yes.
and as you're translating some of this, it's just, It just feels
Very-
mass confusion.
It is
Exactly,
confusing.
it's so confusing.
It's very confusing. It's going to be confusing for parents. It's going to be confusing for school districts. It's going to be confusing for attorneys because what do we do with this law? It goes on to say that the act only encourages a district to teach students. It only encourages a district to engage students in creating a safe environment. It only encourages violence prevention programs. It only encourages them to submit anti-bullying policies and any summary data of bullying incidents. That's a real shame, because then if schools don't do it, you don't have the opportunity to track the frequency, where is it occurring. If you don't track it, it's harder for you to deal with it. And then in bright bold, it says is not actionable, which means that you cannot sue if districts fail to embark on this particular act at all.
So why is there such soft language?
Exactly.
The word, I mean, I just repeatedly heard you say, Susan, encourage.
Encourage.
And such a topic,
Yeah.
right, that has such, as you said earlier in the discussion, the outcomes of this can be so detrimental.
They are.
Yep.
So why do we have such soft language in there?
I think that there was a struggle in getting the bill passed through the legislature. And I think that they wanted to protect the schools, or they were afraid that the schools were going to be sued so easily, that they wanted to have the schools have more autonomy and more rights in how they dealt with it. So I think that was part of their fear. It's the same fear that came about when sexual harassment legislation was passed by the U.S. Supreme Court all those many years ago in the schools. So I think that's what they're afraid of. But, excuse me, it really has to be persistent. Bullying is not a one-off. It's not me saying, Uma, what did you wear that necklace for with that shirt? It really looks lousy. That's unkind. It shouldn't be said, but it's not considered bullying because it's not persistent. Now, if I were to do that daily with the intent of wanting you to feel bad, of intent of really trying to demean you, and it was ongoing, then it's bullying. So sometimes people think just conflict between two students is bullying. Well, not necessarily. Even a fight between two students, if it's a one-time shot, it's generally not considered bullying. It shouldn't occur. It's a fight, etc. Go
So
ahead.
if it has to be consistent, then someone should be like keep on tracking that. How
Yes.
many times he's
Yes.
doing, or because every time they can't go back and say, you know, he's bullying me, They can't.
That's right.
I don't know, is there any way to track that information like that, or?
There is. You can track it. You've got to have a purposeful way to document, and what is it that you should document. And of course, teachers are busy.
Yes.
And they might see many bullying incidents, and so, okay, I'll do that after school, I'll document. And then you sort of forget. It helps if there's a form that you can use, but the form is not required, just to document what happened, where it happened. Where it happened is important. When it happened, who is the target, who is the offender, who are the witnesses, what was done in response to the bullying incident. And then those things should be reviewed, say, once a month by a committee to say, look, we're starting to see now that it was, you know, George who was the offender in 3 out of 10 cases. We need to do more than just confront him. We need to do some more teaching. We need to bring in his parents, whatever the case might be. So the tracking is pivotal.
Okay, well said as always.
Thank
Susan,
you.
Thank you for being here
I
and for all the
appreciate
great work you do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Uma, it was a pleasure, as always, to see you.
Oh, nice. Thank you, Ali.
And we thank you for being with us today on It's a Woman's World, and we hope to see you next time.